Is this the one with the elevator?
I'm sorry?
The car elevator? Is this that one?
No, this is Block 67, which
Next
was
to Japantown. That
Oh,
one.
right near
got it.
Japantown.
Yep.
So you do have staff recommends approval of the time extension to allow sufficient time. It's a very complex project. It's a large project, and we don't think it's unreasonable to request an extension of time to work through all the issues. You do have a motion sheet in your Dropbox, if you choose to do that.
Does anybody want to have any discussion on this? Somebody make a motion.
I would like to make a motion. Based on the information presented, I move that the commission approve a one-year time extension for PLN SUB 2017-00418 and PLN PCM 2017-00419, Block 67, Plan Development and Conditional Use at approximately 131 South 300 West.
I'll second.
Any discussion? Okay. Oh, okay.
Clearing your throat.
Okay. Brenda,
Yes.
Weston,
Yes.
Carolyn,
Agree.
Matt,
Yes.
Amy,
Yes.
Sarah.
Yes.
Adrian,
Yes.
Clark.
Yes.
The motion passes. Okay, then we'll move on to our first public hearing for the rezone and master plan amendment.
Okay, this is a rezone and master plan amendment request for a property located at 515 South, 400 East. The request is a rezone from the RO, which is residential office zoning district, to the RMU, residential mixed use zoning district, and accompanying master plan change from residential office mixed use to high mixed use. Property location is here. It fronts on 400 East. Small parcel, and you might look familiar as this body dealt with a rezone on the adjacent property about a little bit more than a year ago. So it's the parcel that's outlined on the screen for you. It's part of kind of a larger square block. The adjacent property was rezoned to RMU, so this is the piece that's left as RO. There's a picture of the existing building on the site. It's physically connected to the buildings on the adjacent parcel, which are now zoned RMU, so they're looking for a change to that same zoning district to make the greater parcel uniform, if you will. The area zoning is kind of a patchwork of zoning. 1995, the city did a number of rezonings in that area as an attempt to try to make the existing development match the zoning. So you've got a patchwork of anything from public lands to various RMU zones, RO, which is residential office, SR3, which is essentially single-family residential, some RMF 45, RMF 75, CM, and then the TSA zones, which are the closer to 400 South, you get into the TSA zones. The property itself is about a half mile to either the track station between 6th and 7th East or the library track station on 400 South just by the public library. So it's about a half a mile from both of those. There was no specific site development plan submitted with this application. The stated intent was to allow that, the different zoning to allow flexibility for future redevelopment options for both multifamily or mixed-use developments. And current zoning, as I said, was RO. It allows office and residential, but no retail or commercial uses. RMU would allow commercial, retail, and mixed uses. And the RMU zone does include some design standards. Considerations and staff analysis. One of the interesting things with RO zoning is that the height limit of RO is 60 feet unless it abuts a zoning district with a higher height limit. In that case, it then can go to 90 feet. So the rezoning of the adjacent parcel to RMU now allowed this piece of RO to actually go to 90 feet rather than 60. So the rezoning to RMU would knock it back to 75. So they would actually be getting less height than would be possible under the RO zoning. In terms of, we looked at, it's located along a major arterial. It has good proximity to downtown. It's in the east downtown area and covered in the master plan. The proximity to transit has been mentioned, and that recent rezoning of the adjacent property, and also looked at compatibility with adjacent properties. So staff is recommending that the Planning Commission forward a positive recommendation to City Council for both the master plan and the zoning map amendment.
Any questions?
Yeah, I do. David, can you, that's really interesting about the adjacent zoning, that it could go up to 90 feet if it's adjacent. Where did that come from?
I can't say for sure, but that was in our, maybe, I don't know if Wayne knows any history on that, but that was one of the things included in our RO zone, which is interesting quirk anyways.
Our RO zone it's getting a little antiquated. Where that extra height came from, I'm not sure. A lot of the RO zoning is kind of in the central community area where it was maybe located next to like a downtown zone or something. It allowed that extra height. It doesn't work everywhere.
Okay, that aside, when I look at this and I see the adjacent homes, I'm wondering, what's the city's approach, what's the zoning approach to some buffering when there's literally, they're smack up against each other?
Again, how it is now zoned RO, there is just the required landscape buffers, things like that. There's no, in the RO zone, there's no step backs when adjacent to low-density residential or anything like that, so.
But in the RO zone, there's a 15-foot side setback, and the new zone would have a 0 side setback, right?
Let me see, the two setbacks, I think comparing the two zones, the general yard requirements, in the RO zone, yes, you would have a side yard setback of 15 feet and a rear of 30 feet. And in the RMU zone, there's not a required side yard setback. The rear of 30 feet does still apply.
And so I assume the property line, the driveway that goes back to the parking on the south side of the parcel, I guess in theory, I mean, just looking at the satellite image, and I wish I had looked closer on the tour today, but it looks as though the single family property also goes right up to the property line. And so it seems like this would then make it so they would both be right next to each other. They could be.
Potentially,
Is there
yes.
anything that would stop that from happening?
Yeah,
like
the RMU,
fire code or something?
Yeah, actually in the landscape chapter, for the RMU district, there's a 10-foot landscaped buffer when the RO is adjacent to single family.
Okay. And is that single family zoning or is that single family use?
Oh, you're right. Actually, that's single family zoning. In this case, this is zoned RMF 45,
so.
multifamily, so that actually wouldn't apply to that zone.
But to answer your question, it goes to the zoning, not how the property's been developed.
Okay. Sorry.
Go.
Sorry. What the setback also along the street face of the RMF 45s, I assume they all have, what is the RMF 45 setback? Do we know?
I believe it's 15 feet.
15 feet, and so this would be setting a different setback for that street face?
Front yard in the RMF 45
Thank you, Wayne.
is 20% of the lot depth, but need not exceed 25 feet.
Okay,
So it depends on the lot depth.
And is there has there ever been a discussion by the city council or planning staff to, I've had this question before when we've changed zones, which will then change the setback, which then ultimately changes the look and feel of that street face. And is part of the master plan of 500, or I guess 400 East, connected to the 500 South component of this, but are we trying to make the street face reduce the setback, and is that like a goal for the master plan, or is it not?
No, I don't believe that was a goal in the master plan. We are trying to make the area more walkable, and there is a recognition that there's a lot of residential density in that area, so it would be nice to have some commercial, the ability to develop some commercial to serve that residential component so that not everything is a drive to get to commercial type uses.
And last question, can we make a decision that changes the zone but has a setback for that parcel, or can we not add that addition?
No.
No? Okay.
So can you just describe a little bit the difference between RMF 45 and RMU?
RMF is a strictly multifamily zone. It doesn't allow a commercial or office component. And the height limit on RMF 45 would be 45 feet. I believe you can go to 55 feet through probably a planned development or conditional building and site design review process. But again, it's strictly a multifamily zone. It's not a mixed-use zone.
Zone, it's just a denser multifamily, well, not the densest, but,
It's a
Fairly.
medium-density residential zone.
okay.
The master plan and the zoning actually anticipates a little different land use in the future than what's existing with just the single family there.
Right, right.
It's anticipating medium to high-density residential in that area to the south of the subject property.
In comparison to residential office, RMU, are there any uses that would be considered more intense that are open in RMU than RO, or is it pretty much, I'm not seeing a use table in the report.
It's mainly the fact that you could actually do retail sales, service kind of thing, so small storefronts. You can also do the office component in the RMU. I believe both zones allow a restaurant. It was just that ability to have some kind of retail component was different in the RMU.
And residential.
Right. Yes, both zones allow residential.
Got it. So it's a retail component, okay.
So if the zoning is changed, then the building that could be built there might have a restaurant, it might have a small takeout grocery, it might have McDonald's, it might have almost anything, because it also doesn't require parking for those uses. Is that correct?
No, there is a parking requirement.
Okay, what is the parking requirement?
I believe it was in the staff report, but let me look that up.
For individual uses, okay. And so, but it sounds like it can be put pretty much right up against that house and the other houses on that block.
With the landscape buffer, probably.
No, there's
Landscape
no
buffer
landscape
of-
buffer. You
Oh,
can
no,
put it
that's
right
right.
up against the property line.
So,
So it could be up against the property line.
so with the landscape buffer of how, you
No,
do
it's
have
not
to have room
required.
for plants to,
No, there's no landscape buffer.
Buffer
I
required.
was
so it could be
mistaken.
right up against the property line of that
Certainly can,
house,
yeah.
right?
Yep.
And, 20, extend 20 feet in front of it, of where it is now, correct? So I'm sitting on my front porch and boom, next door is a McDonald's, with people coming in and out. It's like literally on my property line.
Anybody else?
So was there a thought to rezone RM F45 as opposed to RMU? Was that evaluated separately?
We looked at that. I mean, generally, it wouldn't give them, it would cut in half the height they're allowed to build now, so I don't see that as kind of a viable alternative. If they were looking specifically to develop mixed use, we wouldn't rezone to a zone that doesn't allow mixed use. It would actually further restrict what would be allowed in the RO zone that currently exists.
So David, when I look across the street in the north, we have parcels that are zoned RMU 45. Are there other RMUs that would allow for higher height? But I'm assuming maybe that does the RMU 45 have a setback?
Wayne will look that up, I'm sure.
And then I guess I'm just wondering if we have other RMUs that maybe aren't displayed here on this map that allow for greater height.
Yes, RMU at the corner of 300 East and 500 South. I've got the pointer on it. That is an RMU parcel over here, the Seasons at Library Square. So that was rezoned a couple years ago to RMU, just plain RMU.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, are there other RMUs with a height part on it, like the ones on the north, RMU 45? Are there RMU 65, RMU
No,
75?
no. There's an RMU 35 and RMU 45, and both those respectively allow, the RMU 35 allows up to 45 feet through the CBSDR process. The RMU 45 allows to 55, and then the RMU without a number after it is just the 75 feet.
What was the middle one, RMU, that allows for 55 feet?
45.
Oh, right.
The same zoning that's
I
across
see,
the
yeah,
street.
yeah.
In the RMU 45, you were asking about the setback. It also doesn't have, when you get to more intense uses like non-residential and multifamily, it does not have an interior side yard setback unless it abuts a single or two-family zoning district. So it'd be the same situation with the RMU where there would be no side yard setback.
Is the applicant here? Hi.
Hey, how are you?
Good. State your name for the record, and you have 10 minutes.
Okay. Adam Davis with the Rockworth Companies, and thank you, and we appreciate being here tonight and the discussion that has happened thus far. So our vision for this site and for what is happening here on the east side of Salt Lake is to rezone this to allow for, again, the optionality and the mix of uses that come with the RMU zone. The idea, it's an existing office building. Our intentions are to redevelop it with multifamily and have the opportunity to do some type of mix of uses and retail if market conditions allow for that. So as we've worked with David and with the staff, we feel, again, very comfortable with the surrounding uses, the compatibility, especially given the parcel just to the north of us, which was zoned RMU for very similar reasons, having the optionality of mix of uses and creating a more walkable, livable, dynamic neighborhood here on the east side of Salt Lake that is obviously, within walking distance to tracks, within walking distance to 4 South, within walking distance to a number of employment centers in the city. So that's our vision for this parcel, is primarily multifamily with an opportunity to incorporate a mix of uses, again, based on market demand. We understand the the issues with the setbacks and some of those things. One of the things that I would point out on the site itself, on the south side of the site, and bear with me if I can get the best. Hoping for an existing image. On the south side of the site, and one of the things that we've identified, I think there were some concerns about the lack of a setback up against those single-family homes. Access to our existing, we have a shared parking agreement with the site just to the west of us. And access to that parking happens on the south side of the site. It's not our intention at all to disrupt that access. So even though there's not a required setback, just out of practicality, we're not going to disrupt that parking, that access to the parking, and so there will be a pretty sizable buffer between that single-family home and the south side of our building.
Is that a recorded easement?
The parking easement? Yes, it is.
Any questions?
And who did you say that agreement was with? The property owner where?
It's the property owner to the north and west of our site, so up on the map.
To the east, the RMU, the
Oh, I'm
RMU
sorry,
one?
the north and east,
Okay.
yes, sorry.
Okay.
That parking structure is kind of under the RMU.
Yep, right under the RMU.
Property owner is not you,
To the east and north of us, no.
Yes.
It is not.
but your building is connected to that building, is that correct?
The building is
And that's one of the
currently,
reasons why we're being asked to change the zoning here?
The building
Because
is-
the building's connected?
currently connected to that building.
Okay, so, but
in-
redevelopment would indicate that that connection would have no further, you'd have no further interest in that connection?
To that existing building? No, in the event of redevelopment, we don't anticipate connecting to that building.
And it's true that the building to the north is also, the property to the north is also planned to be redeveloped. So do you have a parking easement on that parking, or just an agreement, or what's your deal there?
So there's an existing easement that's probably been in place for 30 or 40 years, since those buildings were originally developed.
Uh-huh. Okay, and so is that going to keep them from demolishing their parking and rebuilding it to suit what they're going to build on that site?
We'll work that out with them. We have,
When you work that out, could you possibly take out the access on the to the parking from Fourth East, sorry?
no, the way that we're looking at this is that in the short term, we don't know when and if they're going to redevelop.
Right.
And so in the short term, what our plans are to develop and keep that parking in place and keep that access in place.
But in the long term,
If-
you plan to redevelop, but that's why you're coming to zoning, to the planning commission, correct?
Well, we plan to redevelop, yes. I don't know their plans. I mean, they've obviously rezoned it, but I have no sense of their timetables.
But if you do redevelop it, you'll have to either make an agreement with them about you will have to make an agreement about the parking, correct?
We will.
Anything else? Okay, if you step back, we'll do the public hearing.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll open the public hearing. Is there anyone from the community council here to speak on this? Is there anyone here who would like to speak on this? Come up and state your name for the record.
Hello, my name is Joseph Briggs. I live in the property directly to the south of the parcel. I saw the survey stakes go up, and it was rather alarming to see that the property line is right up against the north wall of the building that I live in. And not only have I been taking care of yard work for the north property, I'm in support of the zoning change in principle, but I think without an actual site plan, a site design, it might be difficult to gauge whether or not it's appropriate because of that zero setback. And that's really my only problem. I mean, the site does kind of tell them that they should use the curb cut they have and the parking access they have, but if they start developing and have, you know, an as-of right to develop what they want according to the zoning, then I may be looking at the scenario that Brenda was describing earlier. And so without a site plan, it's hard to gauge whether or not they're actually going to do the appropriate thing. That's about all I have to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wants to speak on this one? Seeing no one, I'll close the public hearing. Bring it back up to us. Do you want to have staff come up, the applicant?
Can I ask a question of staff? So when a development plan is prepared, what is the approval process?
It depends on what they're proposing. We would have to look at that development plan. Now, if it meets the setbacks and things like that, it could be built by right. If it's asking for some relief from the zoning ordinance standards, whether it's setback or other things, then it may have to go through a planned development or other process. So hard to say, since we don't have a development proposal with this. We would have to evaluate that at the time to see how it meets the zoning.
So David, the building is connected to the other one on the east side. Is that their property line where you've outlined it in orange, the slide previous? Is that the property line?
Approximately, I think the
So the
applicant probably.
RMU would require a 30-foot rear setback from that property line.
Correct.
The likelihood is we would probably see whatever, because they would want relief from that. I feel like,
It's possible. I couldn't speculate on their development plans.
yeah, you know, you can't speculate, but, so just to make that clear, if it goes to an RMU, it does require a 30-foot setback from that rear line, which is currently connected to what looks like the parking structure, just from the top.
Correct.
Unless that's considered a side yard in the redevelopment plan. If it's facing 400 East, if there's some structure that's facing 400 East, then that might be, we see this all the time.
But then we would get a buffer between that single-family home.
Oh, no, I'm talking about weren't you talking about the RMU?
Yeah.
That's already RMU?
No, I was talking if this parcel is rezoned RMU
And redeveloped.
redeveloped, it would require
I
a
see what you're saying.
30-foot setback in the rear yard,
I see
which
what
would
you're
be the
saying.
east.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was
Correct.
thinking you were talking
Okay.
about the other project. Now I understand what you're saying, thanks.
Okay, so I'm just trying to look at what the likelihood is of what they would be doing by right on this, with this boundary.
You have a pregnant thought, Weston, I can tell.
How deep is the lot, do you know? To Amy's point, because that is
Did not get a dimension on
very
it, sorry.
sleuthy.
I'll get it for you in just 1 second.
Okay, great, thank you.
And then on the RMF 45s, in order to make a multi-family unit, what would be the width of the property required to do that?
On an RMF 45? Not sure what the lot width on RMF 45, those ones look like they would be probably substandard to what's required in the
That's what I
zone.
was-
So,
So,
because they are essentially laid out like single-family lots,
right,
so.
so I guess that's kind of ultimately my point, is that I'm wondering if these the parcel directly to the south, and probably the next one and the next one, they would probably, in order for anything to be feasibly built in RMF 45 to take advantage of the density, they'd have to combine those parcels.
You would be looking at probably some lot consolidations, correct?
What's the front yard setback in the RMU? 15 feet?
15 feet.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to hear what the depth of that lot is, because we'd have 45
The
feet tied
depth of
up
the
in-
lot is, I mean, I'm taking a very rough measurement off of our tool here, and it's around 100 feet.
And so typically then, if it goes to an RMU, 45 of that 100 feet would be setbacks, front and rear yard.
So, yeah, and let me clarify some things on the front yard in the RMU. The RMU front yard setback kind of depends on the land use. So if you're doing kind of very low density stuff like single family attached, things like that, it's 15 feet. But if you do multifamily or other residential uses of that sort or non-residential, there is no front yard setback.
And the rear yard is 25% of lot depth, but need not exceed 30 feet.
Right. So in this case, with a 100-foot deep lot, if you're to do multifamily or non-residential, commercial or something, you're probably at about 25 feet for a rear yard. And no setback required in any other yard area.
I don't know if any of you guys care, but I looked at the compared to the land use table. So assisted living and reception center and general retail and nursing kind of homes are the main use differences that are in RMU, but not in RO.
Correct.
But almost all those are actually allowed in a RMU 45 zone as well.
Correct.
One of the bigger land use issues between the RMU and the RO is the RO does not allow any retail. Does not allow restaurants, doesn't allow any of those types of uses, but the RMU.
Or assisted living type facilities.
Right, yeah, I'm just looking at more of the commercial side.
Thoughts, comments, a motion?
Once again, I am not in favor of this change in the zoning. I was not in favor of changing the zoning on on Fifth South for the reason that the RMU zoning, as you can see very clearly in the one that was actually changed to RMU, allows the projects to come right up to the full basically coverage of the property, and that shows it very clearly there on that one that was changed already. I believe that Fifth South has, and and Fourth East, but let's just talk about Fourth East since that's what we're talking about now. Fourth East has a condition of being at least south of Fifth South, a residential street with a residential type of setback, which includes a sidewalk that is shady and pleasant to walk on, and no retail activity. And I don't believe that there's really any particular market reason to insert retail activity into that area at this point. I don't think we have a sense from that would be necessary when we haven't seen that kind of development on any of the RMU 45s that we have already approved here, that are already there. So, absent a giant fact that there's a huge market demand for this, absent and I think Mr. Briggs was pretty eloquent that why can't we make a change on this site when when an actual development proposal comes in, so we can review it. We can review it at that time for exceptions or conditional uses, or even a zoning change at that time when we can actually see a development product that that will let us understand how it works with the sites around it. For all of these reasons, I don't see any real urgency in changing this zoning, and I also see some negative consequences to it, possible, as Mr. Briggs said, to his property to the south, and to the other residential properties on this street at this time.
We need a motion.
Well, I would just say that it's not required, and it's really not part of our review when looking at a rezoning petition to look at a site plan. The analysis is whether this proposal fits in with the adjacent zones and is otherwise consistent. What they want to do with the property in terms of detailed development, that's a separate analysis, and I think we've been asked to consider a rezoning petition for this parcel, and we don't have a development plan at the moment. That's not part of the request. So I think we need to evaluate the request based on what's been submitted, and not use or require a development plan as part of this application or part of our decision-making process.
Nevertheless, I still disagree that this should be done. I think it does not fit with the surrounding zoning, particularly the RMF 45 zone to the south, the residential projects to the south, the nature of the street itself and its quality as an open space. All of these things are under our consideration for a zoning change, and therefore I am against it.
Well, I would say that this RO hole that's been created, whether you agree with the RMU rezone or not, we end up with this parcel that's now zoned RO that's totally inconsistent with anything that's adjacent to it. So for those reasons, I would say it would make more sense to forward a positive recommendation to City Council.
Actually, it is inconsistent with the setback on the RMF 45 zone, and that is an important consideration. It is inconsistent with the use on the RMF 45 zone, so.
But it's entirely inconsistent with the height that's allowed in an RO zone.
I'm ready to make a motion. Based on the findings and analysis in the staff report, testimony, and discussion at the public hearing, I move that the Planning Commission recommend that the City Council approve the proposed master plan and zoning map amendments, files PLN-PCM 2018-00642 and PLN-PCM 2018-00643 for the property located at 515 South 400 East. Proposed zone change from the RO zoning district to the RMU zoning district and corresponding master plan amendment.
Do we have a second?
I second.
Okay, any more discussion? Okay, I'll call for the vote. Brenda?
No.
Weston?
For some of the same reasons that Brenda stated, and because I always have to go with worst case scenario of what could be built on the property, and I think the setbacks are problematic for the properties to the south, so I'll vote no.
Carolyn?
No.
Matt?
I would agree that we don't need a development plan to assess the project, but I think I was opposed to some of the setbacks and stuff when we kind of moved before with the last slot, so I'll vote no.
Amy?
No.
Sarah?
Yes.
Adrian?
Yes.
And Clark?
No.
The noes have it.
I would also like the minutes to reflect the comments that were made as clearly as possible so that the City Council, if they have to reconsider this, will we'll be able to discern why the planning commission turned this down.
I need to jump in. You didn't turn this down. All you did at this point was
Made a motion,
You made a recommendation.
support a negative recommendation.
actually, and all you did was, there's no support for this motion. So if there's a motion to forward a negative recommendation,
Yeah,
somebody
we would
needs to
need a
make that.
motion to forward a negative recommendation. Okay?
Based on the findings and analysis in the staff report, testimony, and discussion at the public hearing, I move that the Planning Commission recommend that the City Council deny the proposed master plan and zoning map amendments, files PLN PCM 2018-00642 and PLN PCM 2018-00643 for the property located at 515 South 400 East, proposed zone change from the RO Residential Office Zoning District to the RMU Residential Mixed Use Zoning District and corresponding master plan amendment. The standards that are not being complied with are compatibility with the remaining parts of that street, specifically setbacks and residential uses.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Any discussion? Okay, we'll vote. Brenda?
Yes.
Weston?
Yes.
Carolyn?
Agree.
Matt?
Yes.
Amy?
Yes.
Sarah?
No.
Adrian?
No.
And Clark?
Yes.
Okay, the yeses have it, and just we're forwarding a negative recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to the Cottage Court Plan Development Major Modification.
Hello, this is I'm Doug. This is a major modification to a plan development that was approved a couple of years ago. Began with a different developer and a different planner, but here we are. It's located on 9th East, roughly 30th South, so it's on the edge of the city. In fact, I believe across the street is East Mill Creek, so it's in the far ends of the city. Basically, it consists of, there were 4 homes on the site. 3 of those have been demolished, and the plan development consists of 16 single-family homes on 2 private streets. This is the preliminary subdivision that was approved. The request for the major modification is, let me back up and I'll show you on the second home from the left, or third home from the right, is one that has not been demolished. It's still there. And so the developer has proposed keeping that, and it would occupy lot 207, which on your screen where it says phase 2, right below it says 207, that's basically where the existing home sits. The reason for this is basically that they've found that they could build the other 7 homes on that street and retain the existing home. The existing home actually faces 9th East at the present moment, so there would be some remodeling to move the front door to the interior street as opposed to facing 9th East. And this home, which is the center home on the picture on the screen, would be separated from 9th East by new construction. This is a major modification because the list of minor modifications is a fairly narrow list of what staff could do, and so we're bringing it to the Planning Commission. We did notice this and took it to the Sugar House Community Council. Haven't had a lot of feedback, but the feedback that we have had is basically that it's a good thing to have some architectural diversity. The second part of this is that home, because it's an existing home, it no longer, it has no room to add a garage on it. And so they would put the parking in the front yard. And I do want to clarify that it's the front yard on the interior court. It's not the front yard on 9th East. I think the staff recommendation would have been different if the parking were on 9th East, but it's interior to the block. So basically that's it.
Can you be more specific about where that parking's, I mean, is it just going to be parallel right in front of the house?
It's
Okay.
basically a pad. It doesn't show up too much on this drawing. Basically,
see.
this drawing looks like a wider sidewalk, but there is room for 2 parking stalls right there.
Oh, okay.
The street's narrow enough that there's no parallel parking elsewhere on this interior court, so there would only be those 2 stalls in front of that specific home.
It's parallel parking.
Parallel, yes.
Do we actually have a site plan?
I believe there was one.
It's lot 207, right?
It's lot 207.
Uh,
I know.
33.
Trying to find where it is. This is a big staff report because the original staff report is included. Trying to figure out which page it's on for you.
New staff report does not have a site plan?
I guess
Has it?
I don't,
Molly's saying
Going
page
right to it.
19 of what was in Dropbox.
okay.
It's the old site plan.
I'll pass this around.
There it is, yeah. Page 19 is the old site plan.
Yeah, look at page. Eighteen and 19 also.
So, Doug, so parcel 208 will be on 9th East, where
Yes.
currently that's the front yard of this house that's not being demolished.
Now, repeat that question?
So lot 208 is going to go on what was currently the front yard of this
Yes.
house that has not been demolished.
Yes.
I can't really tell from this particular site because it looks like the driveway is facing that interior street, but is 208 engaging 9th East?
Yes, basically the facade in the original staff report done by Anthony shows there is a full porch and front door that faces 9th East. And the parking is accessed from the interior court. So the garage doors don't face 9th East, but the front doors do.
Okay.
And those homes have not changed since the plan development approval.
Right. I remember this when it came before the community council. I wasn't on the planning commission at that point, and we talked about other houses to save than this one. But, so they'll have to redo and put their front door facing this interior court versus now it's facing 9th East, is what you said.
Yes. Yes, the existing home is set back far enough that the new home can be built in front of it, but it has a porch that runs the full length of it, and that porch will be removed and the door moved to the north side.
Okay, thank you.
So this street is not a cul-de-sac, right?
Well, It's a cul-de-sac without the round thing at the end, I guess. So it is a dead-end street. It doesn't have a rounded turnaround, but it does have built into it some easements so that there is room for fire service to back around and that. I know fire has some concerns, but it was approved based on their previous recommendation, and that part of the plan development is not changing at all. So,
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Can I see the site plan again?
Brenda, are you going to have questions for Doug, or shall we bring the
Go
applicant
ahead
up?
and
Okay.
ask the applicant to come forward,
Okay.
please.
Goes back that way.
Sorry, thank you.
So could we bring the applicant up? So state your name for the record, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Barry Gittleman. I'm the president of Hamlet Homes. We'll be the builder of the homes. Michael Brodsky, who is the applicant, is with Hamlet Development, our development partners. And as staff already stated, essentially we had approval for Phase 2 of Cottage Court a while ago under a different developer. As the home builder, we communicated to that developer that we wanted the ability to assess the existing home and either renovate it or demolish it and build a new home in its place. After we did that assessment, we quickly realized that it would be better for the community and the area and the aesthetics to retain the home and renovate it. It's in nice condition. And that somehow got miscommunicated or slipped through when the original developer got his approval for the plans. So the original plan said that the home was going to be demolished, and we think that would be a mistake for the area and the community, so we'd like to retain the home and renovate it. And so that's the main reason for the request. As was mentioned, it also would require a modification to the parking. And so the 7 new homes that we would build in Phase 2 would all have a 2-car attached garage and 2 parking spaces in the driveway for those homes. And then this home would not have a garage. It doesn't currently have a garage. And so we would rotate the front door to face the new street, as all 8 homes in Phase 2 will face the new street. And then we would do parallel parking with 2 spaces in front of this home. Nothing else in the plan would change, and if anyone would like to see it, we also have copies, a little bit easier to see, of the rendering that's up on the screen, which it's a little hard to see as well, but that parking for the parallel parking would be a material called grasscrete, so it would essentially be blocks for the parking area with grass growing in between them to soften the feel of that and make it look a little bit nicer for the area and the community. And that's it. Any questions?
Questions for the applicant?
You don't have a dimension on that parking area on this. Do you happen to know what the length of it is?
I don't have it in front of me in my notes, but I know that it was designed for 2 cars to park, parallel parking in front of each other.
Okay, thank you.
I forgot to mention that we also met with the Sugar House Community Council and went over our plan with them, and they were supportive as well of the new plan and retaining and renovating that home rather than tearing it down.
Okay, anybody else? Any questions?
These homes will be market value?
Yes, they will.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll let you step back and we'll do the public hearing.
Thank you, ma'am.
So we'll open the public hearing on this question, and first up is Sugar House Community Council.
I just realized I forgot to fill out a card.
It's okay.
You've got a few from me already. My name is Judy Short, and I'm the Land Use Chair for the Sugar House Community Council. We were pleased to see this project come back before us with a request to save the existing home. We prefer that anytime we can get it, when there's a home that's in good enough condition that it's worth renovating. And I think that was our original request with the first developer. And I don't know where the miscommunication happened on that. This was a two-part, Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 1 is completely built. There are 8 nice new homes, the 2 on 9th East face 9th East. They're all sold, they're all occupied, they're all landscaped, they look great. And these homes, I think one home is already sold of these 8. So we're excited to have some nice new traditional-looking houses in Sugar House. We need lots of housing, and particularly new single-family housing. That's really hard to find. Housing that's not a townhome, so it has maybe room for children to play. So we asked a lot of questions about the parking, because, you know, it's like if you have Thanksgiving dinner, where does your family park? But this is also on the south side of Phase 1 is the LDS Church parking lot. And they have been very accommodating the construction equipment on their parking lot while these were being built. And they're willing to have visitors park there. So we think that's a good solution to not having an extra garage and driveway in this house. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the audience who wishes to speak on this? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing and bring the applicant and staff back up. Questions? Nobody? Wow, they're really quiet tonight. Really quiet tonight.
One thing I did forget to mention, Judy brought up, there is a home in Phase 2 that is sold already. It's actually the one on the left of those 3 homes on Lot 206. That home's sold already but not started. None of the others in Phase 2 are sold, and all 8 in Phase 1 are occupied and closed already.
That's great. That's great.
If people don't have questions, I have a motion.
Go for it.
Based on the information in the staff report, the information presented, and the input received during the public hearing, I move that the Planning Commission approve the proposed major modification associated with PLN PCM 2018-00540 Cottage Court Phase 2, because the proposal is in substantial conformity with the approved development plan.
Andy, second.
I second.
Second by Carolyn. Any discussion? Okay, we'll vote. Start with Brenda.
Yes.
Weston.
Yes.
Carolyn.
Agree.
Matt.
Yes.
Amy.
Yes.
Sarah.
Yes.
Adrian.
Yes.
Clark.
Yes.
Okay, it passes.
Thank
Good
you all
luck.
very much.
Thank you.
I would just like to note also for the planning staff, Wayne, in the future, we would always need a site plan on a particular proposal like this, not just an image.
Yeah, that was definitely a mistake we made in not including
I have
that.
to apologize for that. It was in my draft, and I swear it was in the final, but obviously not.
Okay, we have a work session now. Wayne, it's up to you, I guess.
Well, only a little bit. This is the parking chapter rewrite. We started this project, what's it been? A little over a year ago now, where the city had identified, we've had a number of issues, I guess you would say, with our parking chapter in our code. It didn't seem to quite match where we are market-wise. It's also very complicated and not very easy to read through. So the city initiated a petition to relook at our parking chapter, and also we gathered up some money to hire a consultant to actually help us with that. Like I said, we started this about a year ago and anticipated it was only going to be a couple-month process. However, within that year, we unfortunately lost a few staff members in our office. The person that was actually working on this project moved to a different office, and then we had a number of projects that, like the inland port, that kind of took a front seat to everything we were doing. So we want to jumpstart this project again. We are reassigning this to a different staff member in our office, but we thought we're in the process of doing that. It's going to take a couple weeks for that person to kind of get on board. But what we wanted to do is have the consultant come and give an overview of all the work that's been done, so the Planning Commission can kind of get an understanding of where we are, and maybe you can start looking at the draft ordinance that we have now. And then after, as we roll through this, we'll kind of towards the end talk about our next steps and how the Planning Commission might want to proceed with reviewing this.
All right, sure.
Yeah.
So my name is Jim Spung. I'm with Clarion Associates, the consulting firm that's been contracted by the city to rewrite this chapter. I'm happy to be here. I'm a former resident of Salt Lake. I'm a U of U grad, and I own property here. So I love Salt Lake, and I'm excited to help you guys sort out parking, which is such an easy topic to talk about, right? It came up in every application tonight. So as Wayne said, I'm here mainly to provide an overview of what the project is, and then to introduce the draft that we have today. And then we'll go over next steps as to what you can anticipate in the future. So first, just to introduce the firm, Clarion Associates is a national consulting practice. They've been around for a little over 25 years. We're made up of planners, attorneys, designers, landscape architects, and really our bread and butter is writing codes. We contract with cities and counties across the nation to do comprehensive rewrites of their entire ordinance. So we've written a lot of parking codes before. Another big focus of ours is plan implementation. So as we go through the PowerPoint, I'll continue to refer back to policies that you guys have adopted that address parking. And then lastly, we have worked with Salt Lake before, and you can see on the bottom there a list of projects that we've worked with Salt Lake in the past. So a quick overview of the project. The scope, as I said, is comprehensive rewrite of Chapter 21A44. So all of your parking and mobility and loading standards. And you can see there the bulleted list of what's included in that chapter. So why update this code? First and foremost, it's really an aim to implement the parking policies that have been adopted over the years. The current chapter hasn't had a comprehensive rewrite in a long time. There have been piecemeal amendments that you've seen over the last several years to try and fix things. And I think the staff has realized that the Band-Aid approach isn't working anymore, and that it really needs to just have a comprehensive look at how it fits into the policies as well as the rest of the code. Some other key elements is to encourage infill and redevelopment, which has been reiterated in a lot of the plan policies that have been adopted. To reconsider the one-size-fits-all approach. Right now there's a parking standard that applies generally citywide. That doesn't really work as well with the variety of development you have. We'll talk about that in a little while. To be more user-friendly, to consider alternative modes, biking, pedestrians. That was another big focus of the policies that we reviewed. And then lastly, to modernize the code to reflect best practices and current national trends. And this is stuff that's It's kind of more theory-based, to where car ownership is going down slowly. The younger demographics are starting to not own as many cars. They don't want to drive as much. So the demand for parking is changing, especially with transit in Salt Lake City, with TRAX and other modes. So we've considered those things in updating the ratios for how much parking is required. So in reviewing all the policies, these are some common themes that we saw. Salt Lake is a place for people, not cars. Again, that goes back to the general question: are we designing places for vehicles or for people to be? And all the policies that we reviewed, the Plan Salt Lake, the Transportation Master Plan, all of your community plans, they all refer to pedestrian friendliness. The next one is to eliminate barriers to economic growth and affordable and sustainable housing. Parking is a good way to do that. Allowing for more flexibility, maybe through shared parking or on-street parking. The last petition we heard tonight was a good example of shared parking, where the LDS Church was willing to share their parking with the adjacent uses. To reduce auto dependency, to protect neighborhoods. This was one that was mentioned probably the most in all the policy documents, is to say we need to provide sufficient parking for land uses, but not to have a detrimental impact on the adjacent neighborhoods with spillover parking. Minimize visual impacts of parking, minimize pedestrian conflicts, so again, pedestrian friendly. And then lastly, to be environmentally friendly, to help reduce emissions. Water quality, if you have huge parking lots and all that water is running into the storm drains, that's not good for water quality. So parking is a way to get at that, as well as the heat island effect. So here's a brief timeline of kind of how this project has transformed over time. So as Wayne mentioned, we began our existing ordinance analysis and review about a year ago. We did our background research, and we also did a detailed review of your current standards and spoke with staff about things that we thought looked weird, that didn't really, that doesn't typically work well in other communities. We then went through a phase of public engagement where we had staff interviews, we interviewed some stakeholders in the community, and we also published an online survey and got a lot of feedback from, I think it was around 200 or 300 respondents that we heard back from. Next, we created an outline of proposed changes. So based on all the feedback we had heard and our speaking with staff and stakeholders, we created an outline and summarized the things that we thought needed to be fixed, and staff reviewed that and signed off. And then we began the drafting phase, which was last January to April. And over the summer, staff has had the document and has made some revisions to that. So that's how we got to where we are today. So the next 10 or so slides are just a high-level review of what the new parking chapter looks like and what's different than what your current standards are today. So first and foremost, this is the new structure or the outline of what's in this chapter. You can see here, we've reorganized the content to be more user-friendly and more intuitive, to where you start with purpose and applicability, how parking is calculated, how much parking you need with required off-street parking, how you can get adjustments to those parking requirements, and then location and design standards. And then you can see there, use and maintenance, non-conforming parking, more administrative things. So first is purpose and applicability. The purpose statement right now in the parking chapter is very broad, so we've revised that to be much more specific. And it's specifically addressing a lot of these targeted policies that are in the plan documents that Salt Lake has adopted. The next update are new compliance triggers. So right now, depending on how much you do on your site, you may not have to comply with the current parking standards or not. So in this new draft, if you add a dwelling unit, or if you expand your building or use by more than 25%, or if you require a conditional use approval, those things would trigger compliance with the parking section. Some exemptions which are new are lots smaller than 5,000 square feet, except for single family and duplex, would be exempt from parking requirements. So if you have a small business that needs to move in, maybe it's an adaptive reuse, or they're building on a small site, they wouldn't be required to provide parking. Minor expansions, so if you're expanding a building or a use by less than 25%, you don't have to comply with these new standards. And then lastly, a change of use within an existing structure, assuming that it doesn't require conditional use or you're expanding the building. So next is the calculation of parking. This is essentially is how does staff determine what counts as a parking space and what doesn't, and how to calculate those. So one thing that we've changed is calculating parking based on square footage and not the number of employees. Right now, in a lot of your non-residential zones, industrial zones, there are requirements to say you need 1 stall per 12 employees. Well, employees come and go, and that's really difficult to administer and enforce. So rather than doing it that way, we just say, provide parking for your building, and uses can come and go as they will. The The next bullet is what counts and doesn't count towards parking. So new in this draft is that there's no limit on structured parking. In several of the policy documents, there were statements saying to incentivize subgrade and structured parking throughout the city. So one way to do that is to say you have a parking maximum of X, but if you have structured parking, then you can go beyond what that maximum would allow otherwise. So that's in this draft. And then the next thing is a conditional use approval would trump any of the parking ordinance standards here. So if someone comes to the planning commission and gets an approval, and you guys say you need X parking, or you can do this to the parking, then your approval would govern. And then lastly, we've clarified the procedures for what happens if there's an unlisted use. So something in the code doesn't have a specific parking requirement. The director can either assign a standard based on the most similar use, or the applicant can submit a study to justify what they think the parking should be, which would eventually be approved by the director. So the required off-street parking is the number. So how much do you need for each land use? And one thing that we've done to really help the document be more user-friendly is we've consolidated all of the parking requirements into one table. Right now they're scattered kind of all over the place, and we think having it in one place makes it much easier to understand and to read, and also to administer. Similarly, we've organized all the uses allowed in each district into one place, into one table. And we've categorized those by category and subcategory. And I'll show you an example of what the table looks like in a few slides. The next big change is we've tailored the standards based on neighborhood context and character. As I mentioned, Salt Lake City is a very diverse place. Your downtown is very different than Redwood Road or the Brickyard area. So having the same parking standard for everywhere doesn't make sense. And then lastly, we've adjusted the parking standards based on our national experience and best practices around the country. So the context approach, we'll spend a little bit of time on this, explaining what it means and how it impacts the parking. You can see here the two images, one of downtown and one of the 300 West big box corridor. Obviously very different parking demands, very different character areas. So we've decided to segment the city into 4 distinct context areas. So a transit context, an urban center context, a neighborhood center, and finally a general context. So the first one is transit. This would be areas immediately adjacent to mass transit. These areas typically have the lowest parking demand. Usually they have no minimums, and if they do, sometimes they're very low. There's some specific examples of what these areas might be in the city. So City Creek, downtown Main Street, the Gateway, Central 9th, these areas that are very urban in nature. And there's a list of districts that fall into this category. The urban center is kind of the next tier up or down, whichever way you look at it. This is a more higher density, pedestrian-oriented development that's in an urban center, lower moderate parking demand. This would be like Sugar House or Marmalade, areas where there's urban activity, but there's still a lot of driving. And you can see the list of districts in this context. The next is a neighborhood center. So this is your smaller, moderate scale shopping node. And this would be your 9th and 9th, areas that typically aren't well served by transit, but that people can walk to in the adjacent areas. They're not a regional draw, typically. And again, there's a list of districts that would fall into this category. And then the last one is the general context. So these are your auto-dependent areas. They're more suburban in nature. They typically require much more parking because people rarely walk or bike to these places. You can see on the left there's the Brickyard development. On the right, again, is the 300 West corridor. So these areas typically need more parking than not. So the districts that fall into this category is everything else that's not included in one of the other 3. So it's kind of a catch-all for parking. So here's a screenshot of the new parking table, and I can walk you through that. So on the very left-hand side, you can see the residential uses as a category. Below that is a household living, which is a subcategory. And then within that subcategory are all of your household living land uses. As you work your way to the right, the first column is your general context, the second is neighborhood center, urban, and transit, and then the very far right-hand column is the maximum parking allowed. So you can see the standards are different depending on where you are in the city, and the maximums also can be different. Generally, they're the same in all context areas, But where they are different, it's specified in that column to say transit context maximum is X, so that it's clear. So those are the required parking. So one thing that the policies and staff also ask Clarion to look at is how can we be more flexible and allow adjustments when they're justified. So one thing that we've looked at is allowing the administrative reduction citywide if specific criteria are met. There's a menu of options for people to reduce their parking that's required, but they can't reduce their parking by more than 40% of what's required. And I'll go through some examples of how someone can reduce parking. So shared parking agreements, that's one way to reduce how much parking you have to provide on site. If you're proximate to transit, you can reduce parking up to 25% if you're within a quarter mile of a fixed transit station in the general and neighborhood context. Affordable and senior housing can have a 25% reduction. Studies show that these types of land uses typically don't require the high parking demand that a market rate project would require. So requiring lower parking is a good idea, and it helps to lower costs and more efficient development.
Just so,
Yes.
because this is one of the questions I had. So we've had a couple projects, or two in particular, where people have kind of like doubled up. So like say you had 100 parking stalls required.
Yeah.
They get a 25% reduction, that's 75, and they get another 25, and they get 25% off that, which would then be, less, and it kind of keeps, like, really drops it
Right.
far because it stacks.
Uh-huh.
So you're saying, like, if you have 100 parking stalls, you could never go below 60, regardless how many of these things you kind of were able to tie
Yeah,
together.
so you can mix and match, and you
Right,
can
and
do
it-
everything, but your reduction
Still
can only
required,
be 40%.
most could be down to 60. Got it.
Yeah, and that number changes, and it's still a draft, so that 40% could be 50 or 20 or 80, it really depends on what the city feels like is appropriate. 40% is a number that I think staff has kind of agreed with, but.
Yeah, that's great, I like that.
But yeah, at the same time, you have to be realistic to say, probably not half your parking is going to be shared parking, or half your parking is going to be absorbed by being close to transit. So it's striking a balance between what's realistic with what the market will support. And then the last bullet there is something that we actually spoke about today with staff. We're discussing possible private on-site car share standards. So we've come to see the scooter movement where scooters are all over the place, and it's probably likely that businesses will grasp onto that model and have cars available on site for the use of the tenants or the users of that property. So if that were to happen, then the parking demand might be lower. So a few other examples. So van and carpool parking for lots with 100 or more parking spaces. A van pool space could be substituted for 7 other regular spaces. On-street parking can count towards parking minimums if you're adjacent to that use. And there's some limitations in the draft. For example, if you're in a residential area that has permits, you can't do on-street parking. Pedestrian-friendly amenities, this is in your current code. This is something that Clarion and staff have been talking about. Right now, there's a reduction allowance if you provide pedestrian amenities on your site for restaurant or retail uses. We're not sure that really translates into reduced parking demand. If you provide a bench on your property, I don't know if less people are going to drive to your site, but that's something that we're talking about with staff, whether to carry that forward or not. And then lastly, if none of those things work, and if the developer has a unique project that doesn't fit the mold, they can submit a parking study to be reviewed by the director, and if it makes sense, then the director can approve an alternate standard. So the next section talks about parking and loading, location and design. So this is your setbacks and how the parking lot is designed. We've removed a lot of the technical design criteria out of the code and put it into a separate engineering manual. We find that's becoming much more popular in cities all over the nation because people don't really care how thick the asphalt is. That's not planning and zoning stuff, that's engineering. So take that stuff out of the code and let the engineers figure out dimensional requirements and things. And cities are also doing that because it's much easier to update those standards to reflect best practices without having to go through a zone text amendment to do that. We've introduced biodetention areas as a landscape alternative. You can see in the image there as an example. Similar to the parking requirements table, we've consolidated all your parking location and setback standards into one place in one table. We've also consolidated all the district-specific location and design standards into this section, and then there are a lot of other revisions that we won't go into tonight, but in the draft, there are footnotes identifying everything that's proposed to be different than what the current standards are. So the next section talks about loading and drive-throughs. We've updated the thresholds for when you have to provide loading docks. Right now, I think a lot of the older ordinances around the nation require too many loading stations. I think even in Salt Lake, there's a loading requirement for multifamily development. I don't know really why you'd need a loading dock for multifamily, but we've reviewed that and updated those standards. And also to reflect that there are more frequent deliveries by smaller trucks now. Rather than having a big semi-delivery every month, you have 5 or 6 van deliveries every week, typically. And then we've also updated the number of vehicle stacking spaces needed for drive-through uses. So the last thing we'll talk about, or the second to last thing, is adjustments. So if you need an alternative to the design standards, there's a couple of ways you can do that. We've clarified the process, the authority, and the limits for who can approve those design modifications. Smaller minor things can be approved by the planning or transportation director. This might be things like the aisle width or parking stall dimensions, things like that. If you have a unique site or if it's an infill or redevelopment project and you just can't make the numbers work and you need an extra foot for something, staff can do that administratively. You don't have to get a variance or come get a special exception. Any larger modifications would require a special exception. And then lastly, we've updated some of the nonconformity standards, essentially establishing language that if you have an existing parking and loading facility, this new ordinance won't make it illegal. It will just make it non-conforming, so they can continue. And then lastly, if your property is made non-compliant because of eminent domain, that doesn't make you illegal either. That would be a legal non-conforming use. And there's an example, if a road expands and eliminates some of your parking stalls or makes your setbacks not compliant, there's nothing that the owner can do about that. So they would be kind of grandfathered into what their current standards are. So with that, kind of a lot of information, very high level view, but the next steps are to keep working on the draft. So staff and Clarion will review the draft and produce a revised version. Staff will then carry forward a public engagement process, and then it will come back to the Planning Commission for review and ultimately a recommendation to the council. So with that, are there any questions?
The survey that you sent out,
Yes.
was that in English only, or was it in any other language?
I believe it was only English, if I remember right. I can't remember, your public engagement folks put that together, but the questions that we gave to them were in English, so I don't know if they translated them or did anything else.
Thank you.
I'm curious if you've looked at, when you do a survey like that, what's your denominator? Is how predictive of it is it of the rest of the population? When you talk to 300 people and there might be what, 1% of the population? Or?
Yeah, I think it's more, when we ask questions, you start hearing the same things over and over again, and I think that's a pretty good indicator that that's probably the general consensus. And I would say the thing that we heard most was about the neighborhood protection, where they say, I don't really care as long as it doesn't screw up my neighborhood, and that's kind of the sentiment for any planning decision. But that's kind of how we gauged what the survey, how to consider the survey when we did the draft.
So you focus a lot on minimums, but in some of the zoning districts, there are parking maximums, and then there are ways you can go above that by adding in certain amenities. Are you looking at that and how it does or does not work with some neighborhood compatibility requirements or issues?
Yeah, so going beyond the maximums. So I don't know if there's a way to exceed
I
the
recall
maximum.
there's in the code you can do certain like transit oriented.
Yeah, in the code right now, you can actually go above and beyond the maximum.
Right.
It's that's actually one of the things too that drove us to review the parking chapter, is because we were finding our maximums weren't really working in all cases. I mean, we had the same parking maximum, you know, if a zoning district was within a quarter mile of transit, but then that same zoning district, a property in that same zoning district was located out off of Redwood, it had the same parking maximum, and we were running into issues with that. So that is one of the things that we're looking at in this process.
Yeah, and this draft, to answer your question, the only way you could increase the maximum is through a parking study, so that the applicant would have to come in and prove through a study saying that I need this many, you won't let me have that many, and then the director ultimately could approve that.
And the one place where you can increase the maximum, and as Jim had mentioned, is if you do, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, but if you do structured parking,
right,
Then you
then
can do as
that
much
is
as you
not-
want, but in
yeah.
terms of surface
Yeah.
parking.
right, surface parking is calculated.
And,
go ahead.
sorry, the rationale for having the structured parking not count toward the maximum is that it's really expensive. So if someone's willing to pay that much to have more parking, more power to them, they probably need it. And like I said, ultimately in the policies, the city really is trying to encourage subgrade and structured parking, because it typically looks better, and you have design standards for parking structures in urban areas, so it will fit better than a surface lot would in the city.
That was going to be my question. So is that the look and feel and how the parking structure would interact with the street, is that covered in the regular zone outside of this chapter?
It's in this chapter.
It would be in this chapter?
Yeah,
Oh,
so
okay.
there are specific standards in each district addressing parking structure design and urban design related things. So we've carried forward most of those. We didn't hear from staff that those weren't working, but they are included in this draft.
Okay.
And then there's additional standards in the specific zones too, where in those cases where you, the parking has to be located behind like an active use or things like that, then that would be also in the base zoning. Excuse me.
Great, thanks.
Did you mention bicycle parking as part of the,
You know, I didn't, but it's in there.
Okay.
And I asked the staff if I should have a slide in there for bicycles. I don't want to leave them out, but it is addressed in here. We didn't make a lot of revisions to the ratios. We did flip there.
did you address scooter parking?
We did not. This draft was before that viral wave. And that's all on-street parking, so that's a little
Well,
different.
I don't think it's beyond the pale. I don't know what the city is doing about scooter parking, but it may be something that fits pretty well in this contract. I don't know.
It could be incorporated pretty easily. Rather than bicycle parking, it should just be alternative.
Bicycle and scooter
Yeah, that
parking.
kind of gets outside of the scope of what we're doing here a little bit too, because it starts breaking into the contracts that we have with the scooter companies and that, so it's probably beyond the scope of what we're.
I think that actually brings up a point I hadn't considered about bicycles. When we allow for a reduction of parking, if they do bicycles, and one of my pet peeves is that the current ordinance allows them to put bicycle like racks behind the building, so no one would even know they're there.
Yeah.
And I don't know that having a reduction in parking is appropriate if nobody knows there's a bike rack for them to utilize. And so I don't know if that's something you can kind of review.
Yeah, so it is part of the ordinance, and that's actually one of the elements that we're taking out into the design manual. So bicycle design, bicycle parking design is in that new engineering manual that has location requirements and design requirements for where that can be, how far from an entrance, things like that. So it is in here. So we
But
thought
you're
about it.
proposing to remove it to the engineering component.
Yeah, it's in the design manual.
And we'll get that to you also, when we get to the, kind of that level where we're getting feeding the information to you, we'll make sure you have a copy of that too.
So yeah, how does that, if it's the engineering component, that's still under land use and planning?
No, so that would be adopted, and Jim, again, correct me if I'm wrong, because you had more conversations on this, but that would be adopted by reference So basically well, let me put it this way, the ordinance would say for engineering standards, dimensional standards, please refer to this manual. But this manual, again, this is only for really kind of strict engineering dimensional things, like my parking stall must be 8 feet 3 inches wide by 17 feet 6 inches long. That's not something that is a land use issue. That's an engineering type component. That's the kind of thing that would be in the engineering manual. The benefit to that is that if there's some new standard that comes out nationwide where it says instead of 17 feet 6 inches, it should be 17 feet, we don't have to go through a code change,
No, I
a year-long
absolutely
code change to
see
do
that. I absolutely see the benefit of that. I guess in just this particular case, the location of the bike rack is my pet peeve, and if that goes to the manual, does that necessarily address my pet peeve of allowing a parking reduction, but then hiding the bike rack from the public?
Yeah, well, we could certainly look into that. and see.
That's kind of my little very focused pet peeve on that relationship between reduced parking and bicycle rack placement.
I have a question about the maximum parking allowed under the general conditions of a single-family use. And it says 4 maximum parking spaces. I know a lot of properties where there's more than 4 parking spaces, especially if, as we always do, we count the area of the driveway that's usable. In fact, so I have technically 4 spaces in my house because I have a 2-car garage and a driveway in front of it. So does my neighbor, but then he has his parking space for his RV that he's built next to the parking garage, which I don't envy, but I might envy if I got an RV. So I'm just wondering. And then there's the guy who's got a 7,000 square foot house and has a lot of parties and has about 10 parking spaces off street. Or the university president who similarly has a lot of parties and has about 10 off-street parking spaces. I'm just wondering how this particular thing is going to play out around the city with fairly large properties that may have a lot of visitors, may have, where I don't think the neighbors are going to be that happy when you shut down their parking. I'm just calling attention to that as a potential issue. I went to a place where, he had a barn in the back and had, parking for the horses and the horse carries, the horse, hauler and, a tractor and a bunch of other, it was zone residential, I know, but,
Well, first of all, I think I'd like to hang out in your neighborhood because it sounds like you have a lot of parties.
My neighborhood has a lot of parties, it's for sure.
But actually, the current ordinance states right now that you can't have more than 4 official parking stalls on your yard, on your lot. There's a difference between usable parking stall, as you kind of said, versus an actual legal parking location. And most people have, if let's say you have just a kind of a standard 2-car garage attached to your house that you have a driveway to that leads into both stalls, that actual driveway in front of your house would not be considered a parking stall from a zoning perspective if we were reviewing the number of parking stalls.
We do count it as a parking stall sometimes when we're looking at these planned developments, where the guy said,
Right.
and we have these, each place has 2 and 2 for guests with their,
And in a lot of those cases, through that plan development process, you're actually approving, through the plan development, a modification to the parking standards, because you might be allowing a parking stall, you might be like allowing a tandem parking stall, or you might be allowing a parking stall in the front yard to satisfy some of those requirements. You know, typically a parking stall, we'll just take a single-family zoning district. Parking is not, for it to count as your required parking, it can't be located in the front yard. Now, that doesn't say you're not allowed to just park your car in your front driveway, but that is not seen as meeting your required parking. Your required parking is on a hard surface area somewhere behind the front building line of your home. And then, so there's a difference between a driveway from a zoning perspective. So I guess what I'm getting at is what you may see as being, you know, limiting, saying, oh, you can't park by putting that 4 number in there. Oh, now you can't park on your driveway in front of your house. That's not actually what this would be doing.
I have a question. Is my neighbor with his extra little parking space, is he out of compliance?
I don't
Especially
know.
since it
I'd
is
have to
in his
look at
front
it,
yard,
yeah.
so to speak.
I have a question. Weston, do you have an opinion about her neighbor's trailer?
No, I don't.
And I could say too that it is unusual to have a maximum for your residential use for a single family. I don't know if I've seen that before. And in reviewing the parking section initially, there's a lot of detail in here that's not very common across the nation. For lack of a better term, it's like micromanaging type language where you specify exactly where things can be and how many things. And typically with ordinances, you say you need this many parking stalls, and as long as you meet the design criteria for your lot, so your lot coverage, your setbacks, your landscaping, you can kind of do whatever you want. If you want to have a parking lot in your backyard, okay, as long as it's behind your house and you can't see it and it meets all the other standards. So it is a bit unusual, but it's a current standard, so we carried it forward. But we could reconsider that if that's something that city
I
wants
think
to
it's
do.
unclear. I mean, if Wayne had to spend a little bit of time
Yeah.
here explaining what's a what and what's a not, you know, and, you know, when does it count and when doesn't, and I'm only interested in making my neighbor park his RV in his backyard and not his front yard, you know, I mean, I think, and I'm, you know, the people, kept their Windstream in their front yard for, you know,
I
6
can tell you
years.
that is actually, RV parking in the front yard is not allowed by the code.
Okay, well, I think that we need to sort of take a little bit more look at this rather than
Okay.
just carry it forward.
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing that I'll mention that was a pretty big change was the restaurant uses. I'm sure you've probably beat that horse to death here in planning commission meetings of restaurants needing more parking than what's allowed. And I want to say right now, the maximum for restaurants was 2 or 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet, which is really low. So we've amended that, and it's in the draft, essentially to allow more parking for restaurants so that you're not creating barriers for restaurant owners to not have enough parking. So yeah, here it is. So the current requirement is 2 spaces per 1,000, and the maximum is 2.5. So that's a pretty tight window, and typically a minimum is like 6 to 8 for a restaurant. So you're about 3 times lower on your maximum than the minimums typically are in most places. So we've revised that to be 5 per 1,000 as a minimum in the general context, and then a maximum of 9 per 1,000.
So will that vary by neighborhood type?
Yeah, so the general context is 5, which is your suburban areas, and the neighborhood context. The urban center context, which would be like Sugar House, is 2 per 1,000 as a minimum, and then there's no minimum in the transit context, which would be downtown. And the maximum for all uses is 9 per 1,000.
But so in the neighborhood context, say in the avenues, it would be 5 per 1,000 for a new restaurant?
As a minimum, as long as they're in one of the districts listed in that context.
Yeah, I would question that.
But if it's smaller than a 5,000 square foot lot, there's no parking minimum. So,
I think you're just going to end up with businesses having to create parking where the demand for parking may not actually be there.
Well,
because people.
I think the other thing is you're gonna get businesses that will put in 9 parking spots and their neighbors are gonna throw a fit.
Yeah.
And that's gonna be a way that they're gonna get denied.
Well, it's a double-edged sword. They don't want them parking in the neighborhood, but they don't want them parking on the site. It's like, where do they, you know, they want to be able to walk to these quaint places, but they don't want them to, you know, if it's a parking lot, then it's not quaint.
Or they're
anymore.
gonna say, well, there's not enough room to put in, you know, the minimum or something, or the maximum, so therefore they should be denied.
Yeah,
People are
and-
always gonna argue about parking.
And a big change here is that regardless of what the minimums and maximums are, there's a lot of tools to adjust either of those through those adjustments that we went through. So a parking study, or if you're close to transit, or however they can justify having less or more. There's some flexibility, but you have to have a baseline at some point to.
So parking consultants will be very busy once this is approved.
Yeah. I know a question that Nick wanted to raise was having any minimums at all in the transit context. Right now, the only minimums in this draft are for residential, and there's no minimums for anything else. He questions if we even need minimums for residential. I don't know. It depends. Cities are all over the map on this. We're drafting a code in Bloomington, Indiana right now, which is the home of Indiana University, and they don't have any minimums anywhere in the city. They only have a maximum. And they just leave it up to the market to say, I think I need this many spaces to lease my space or sell my units, and they're gonna build according to what they can make a profit on. So that's a policy discussion that the city needs to have, but I think Clarion would support the idea of removing minimums in the transit context, just because it's an affordability thing, it's a land efficiency thing, and if you're downtown, the market will drive how much parking you need and don't need, and there's tons of parking already downtown. I don't think there's a shortage of parking anywhere in Salt Lake City, so.
I get it, I think in a suburban context, but in an urban context, are there times that people are building more parking than they need in an urban context? Under what circumstances would someone be like, oh yeah, I totally need more than what?
It just depends on the economics. You know, developing is a math equation. So if they're spending $30,000 to build a structured parking stall, then they're probably going to figure out a way not to build any, if they can. But at the same time, if you have an office space or a unit and you can't lease it without parking, then they're going to provide parking. So the development community, in our experience, has kind of figured out what their niche market is and how much parking they need to lease in certain areas of the country, and for planners to arbitrarily assign a number to say you need this many parking spaces when the planners, that's not really their expertise in assigning those figures. So I think we kind of lean to say let the market dictate what they need to make it viable. Where I think we would step in is for neighborhood protection and things to say if you're adjacent to a single-family neighborhood, then you might need some minimum parking to help mitigate the impacts of how that spillover parking could impact the neighbors. But everywhere's different. It's a cultural thing.
Last general question. So in Salt Lake, we have quite a number of surface pay lots in downtown, especially. Is this, this is not where we really address how to deal with those, because they just kind of stick around.
Yeah, and we were talking about that earlier with staff as well, is that it's probably better addressed in your land use tables. So what's permitted and conditional or not permitted in your districts. So if you have a commercial parking lot that's permitted in downtown, well, people are going to build them. And they don't tend to go away very easy because it's like a storage unit, essentially, where you have zero overhead costs and you get money every day for car storage. So a lot of cities are outlawing them downtown or in a downtown context to say you can only have a parking lot if it's associated with a land use on that lot. You can't just have a standalone commercial lot that you can sell spaces to. So that's probably a land use table thing, but I don't know, Wayne, if you have an opinion.
No, I think that was a good explanation. We had this same discussion today. I think it's something that we're gonna continue to kind of work through over the next month as we work through this, but it does become a land use issue. I mean, there are places where we need the commercial parking lots, or we have them near the airport. But yeah, it certainly don't need those in the downtown area, so.
Yeah, and I know in Denver specifically, they've banned surface parking lots in all of their downtown. There are still some that exist that have been grandfathered, but no new surface lots can come in that are strictly just for commercial parking. One thing this ordinance would allow is shared parking agreements. So if you have a development next to a surface lot that is empty all the time, the two owners could create a shared parking agreement to say, yes, you can use some of my parking.
That's kind of what I'm getting at. I mean, by doing those
Yeah.
shared agreements, then are we stuck, meaning that lot will always be there? Building is reliant on that lot now.
That's a good question, and I think it depends on how the agreement is drafted. One thing that we did revise in this draft is how the city administers those agreements. I think right now you require them to be recorded, and it becomes an enforcement issue with the city to go on private property and regulate how parking is administered. So we usually advise that cities get away from enforcing private agreements to where we say, at the time of development, present a shared parking agreement that both property owners have signed off on. You can take it to the county and have it notarized or recorded or whatever, but essentially it's up to the property owners to figure out how that's gonna work, and if it becomes a problem, it's on their heads. If they're non-compliant with zoning, then they need to fix it. But otherwise, I don't know if, so for example, if a shared parking agreement happened where they shared 50 spots on a vacant lot, and that lot redeveloped, but there's no complaints about it, does the city care, that their shared parking agreement isn't working anymore? Because, I don't know, I guess it's an enforcement by complaint type thing.
And what do you do about it if someone complains? There's a building, you're not gonna tear down the building.
Well, then it's up to the owners, because their zoning agreement was based on that shared parking agreement. So now they're in violation of zoning and have to figure out how to fix it, I guess. So it's a compliance and it's an enforcement issue that, I don't know if there's an easy way to solve.
If you're doing a shared parking agreement, is there any sort of conditional review of those or not?
So the director would review those as part of the application, or the approval body, whoever that would be. And I guess in the future, so for future applications, if, let's say, a surface lot did develop into something else, then as staff reviewed that application, they would probably need to look into see.
I'm more concerned about the surface lot never being developed than a surface lot
Yeah.
developing and being like, what do we do with the parking? I mean, like,
Yeah.
because to me, it just seems that, and I'm fine with the surface lots that are here to an extent, but I just know that some of them sit around for a long time, and they're great
Right.
cash cows for owners who have them, who don't live here. And you walk around, all around Gracie's and Squatters, and that whole corner is all just a bunch of lots, and those lots are never gonna be developed because they're owned, managed by a development company and owned by someone who doesn't live here. The Zephyr would have come down long ago, and but another lot had the city not had a non-demolition permit. And so it's easy, like if you build and say, well, there's a surface lot, so I'm gonna take those lots as part of my agreement, but then it kind of ties that lot will never, ever change.
Right.
We're stuck in that. And maybe over time, parking in general changes and that doesn't matter, but I don't know how you address that problem, but it just seems like I mean, Denver, I don't know when the law changed there. I mean, I used to live there in 2005. I mean, there weren't a lot, it seems like there's more just these vacant lots managed by AMC Parking in Salt Lake than there aren't other immediate downtown centers. I think it's fine, like it's great parking that's available, but it'd be great to get development and different types of parking going in those areas.
Yeah, I can talk to Don Elliott. He's the director of the firm and the manager of this project. And he's got a lot of experience. He's been around at Clarion for almost 25 years, so almost as long as it's been around. And I'm guessing he's drafted 150 codes all over the country. So I can talk to him and see if he's drafted solutions to that issue, because it could potentially be a problem with.
There's a huge incentive to never ever develop that property. because as long as those lots are $100 per month per car in Salt Lake, and it's a pretty good return for an asphalt
Yeah.
sort of.
Well, I think that squatter's lot, the one Gracie's and all that stuff is around, actually has an agreement with Rose never to be developed except as a parking lot.
Right, I mean, so it's stuck.
Questions?
The one thing that we'd like to ask Planning Commission, so we're gonna be getting the ordinance ready, you know, in draft form or for review and do some public engagement. But in trying to figure out this beast, in reviewing, what's gonna be the best way for the Planning Commission to review this? Would you actually like to have maybe a public hearing first? And then have some work sessions after that so you can hear from the public? Or would you rather kind of jump in and start having some specific work sessions on the ordinance where we come in and maybe talk about chunks of the ordinance with you and go through it? Do you have any thoughts on this? Any ideas on that?
So I actually kind of think putting the public hearing first, I mean, it has its merits, because then you can take themes that you're hearing, but I mean, they are themes and you probably already know them. And I wonder if doing work sessions with chunks of them also then serve to help educate the public on perhaps certain things that they were thinking, and then they can change or modify or, you know, ultimately adopt a different view or the same view. But without that information, they don't have that opportunity. I always hope to get a little bit more informed public discussion when they've had the option to have that education.
Well, and we're going to do some public engagement work prior to coming back to you. So we're going to go out there with the ordinance draft out to the public and ask for feedback and ask for public comments through that process. So we will do that part. It's more of, you know, what's the best way for you to be able to digest
I
this thing?
personally think doing some work session in chunks is great.
We don't want to spread this out too
No,
long.
it,
So
they
it
can
might
be
be
in,
maybe 2 meetings
they can
or
be in like,
something.
yeah, they can be in multiple chunks. They don't have to be like in each chapter
Yeah,
chunk. But, you know, and obviously then having us with getting the materials in enough time to read, to be a little bit more prepared.
And that's one thing that we'll do, I think. This draft that Nick had put on today, as you look at it, there's kind of purposely left all of the staff comments and everything so you can see where we're at right now and some of our thought process. One thing we can do is we could just keep this in your Dropbox. I mean, we know that the meeting stuff just goes away, but we could keep a folder, parking chapter, and just keep this in there. So, you know, when you're really wanting to get into some exciting reading before you go to bed, you can just open this right up and start reading about parking ordinances. But at least you can kind of have it and start looking through it a bit.
Yeah, and something else that we encourage staff to do, typically when we do a comprehensive code rewrite, where we rewrite all the zoning standards, is typically before it's adopted, there's a testing period to where they'll still have their old or their current code in place, and the new code won't be officially enacted until like 3 or 6 months later, so that as they're reviewing applications, they can compare the current code to what's proposed, and they can flush out a lot of the hiccups that they identify. So as we're drafting, the staff could also be doing that to say, I'm reviewing this application, let's look at what we have now and what's proposed, and how these match.
So what will the public outreach look like? Like, how do you plan to roll that out?
Well, I don't have an answer to that yet. The planner that we're assigning this to has been on parental leave for the past 6 weeks, and so as a gift, when he got back today, we informed him that he's doing the parking chapter. You're welcome, Eric, by the way, if you're listening. But so that's something that we're gonna start taking on over the next few weeks is getting him up to speed and then start developing a public engagement plan on how we can get the word out.
Something that I think would help me is so all the minimums and the maximums, some context from either some actual professionals or benchmarking to other cities as to why these numbers are what they are. Because I have a really hard time. I mean, we hear from the neighborhood always with the restaurants and stuff and how it creeps out. But like, for example, a crematorium requires 2 per 1,000. That seems like a lot to me. Although I don't know, right? I really don't know. But a library also requires 2 per 1,000. That doesn't seem like enough. But like that, I don't have any professional context or expertise to make a decision around that. And so I don't know how. Either it's like hearing from like, you know, restaurant owners who've been through the process and saying, here's what I need, and here's how I work, and here's how we did, and here's how I did it at this site and why it mattered. Or maybe it's from, you know, here's what Denver, Boise, and Portland do in these contexts. You can kind of, I at least can get a context of how I mean.
Yeah, so just for context, the way that we crafted these was using that approach where we, Clarion, like I said, has drafted, I think, 180 codes. And
give us the public support, because the public's going
Right.
to be here, and give us the tools to help answer those questions and have the public be able to understand it. Not that your expertise is not valuable, but like
Right.
having that citation and so we're trying to review it would be helpful.
Yeah, so would it be helpful to have citations? Because we did compare cities that were a similar size and context and what they adopted, and that informed our decision. It didn't mean that it's
Yeah,
the
it shouldn't
same
guide
here.
it, right, no.
But that's research that we did in doing that. So we can reflect that in here to say Albuquerque did this or Indianapolis did this. And again, it's very context based because every city is very different.
Whether it's we pull out a couple of, maybe we said there's a commission to decide, and we try to find a few people, you know, business owners or residents or people who've actually dealt with this, you know, and try to figure out those experiences, those contexts, and like see how it's played out, or just some better way to, you know, give me a better understanding of like why a crematorium gets the same number of parking as a library.
Mhm.
They actually have funerals there? The body's just dropped off. I kind of get it with the child care. You come and go, right? You're dropping off.
The reality is they probably haven't done studies that specific for
Yeah,
the
but I'm
use.
just like, but I mean, that's one example. Like art gallery.
They just assume a
exhibition hall,
blanket.
1 per 1,000. Like,
Right.
to be candid, I don't really know a 1,000-foot art gallery. How many people go to the 1,000-foot art gallery opening? How many? You know, if you've got a, how many tables do you set at a 1,000-foot restaurant? Like, how many people can you fill in 1,000? What's the capacity of a 1,000-square-foot restaurant? I have no idea. And so, but giving some context to some of these would be really helpful to understanding these minimums and maximums in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and there are professional studies that look at specific land uses and their parking demand or their trip generation. So there are manuals out there that I don't know if they're
In the more controversial
that
ones,
great.
so like multifamily units, you know, big multifamily kind
Yeah.
of developments, restaurants and retail. You know, I think those are the big ones that we hear mostly. is big
And I
multifamily.
wouldn't doubt if you take those studies and you average some of those numbers, you're going to come up with something in the ballpark of what you've already recommended here. So,
Yeah, and again, like I mentioned earlier, I think the development community that's working in this market constantly has a way better grasp on exactly what they need.
Get those people.
Yeah, so that's something that staff could coordinate with.
Yeah, I think that should be
Private-
part of the
the
public
private
outreach
sector,
specifically to
Have them come present on what they're
business owners
doing and why they're doing it,
developers.
and what they need and what they don't.
Yeah,
need.
that was actually in our initial public engagement that we did. We reached out to
Downtown
a
Alliance,
number
I
of the
think.
local developers, so we'll just continue, we'll obviously, we'll continue to do
And I'm
that
sure
with our
some
same
would love to
contacts.
probably come present to us in a work session on why they need more or less parking and pitch us on what they're trying to do. I mean, I would love to hear it. That would be helpful.
or, you know, if we're talking about having no minimums in a residential area, I think there's certainly plenty of people living in this city who currently have no parking because they live in an old house without a driveway, and those people probably, well, I know for sure they have an opinion about this, and I also know plenty of people have an opinion about, you know, how much should they have entitled to in front of their house. So I think that'd be good to hear public hearing around all of that. And maybe even not just public hearing, but set up exact people to give testimony on that.
And an important caveat to that is we were very clear in the survey that this chapter addresses off-street parking. So like issues with parking meters or resident permits and stuff. We accepted comments like that, but we just told them up front, that stuff's not part of the scope of this work. So it's important that people don't freak out about on-street parking, because that's not what this chapter does, other than the on-street parking allowance.
Another one, the swimming pool requires 1 per 1,000, but indoor recreation center requires 3 per 1,000. I mean, basketball court versus swimming pool, has that different of a use? I'm just curious why, it'd be helpful, because these are the issues we're going to try to start. Why? I mean, you probably make good decisions, but educate us on why those are the right numbers.
Mm-hmm.
You're done?
We have seen standards based on the gallon size of the pool.
Yeah, I've seen those.
I wouldn't recommend it, but I think something that's
Just educate us.
yeah.
And they probably came in the same car, right?
They came in the same car. Or it's Tinder. It's my pride. All right, I think we've did Tinder.
Okay. I think we're done. Meeting's adjourned.